The station was enormous. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Kororvathan. It did not float in space so much as it owned the space around it. Its metal arms stretched outward in 6 directions, each one the length of a small moon. Ships from a dozen different species were docked along its sides like fish stuck to a great whale. Lights blinked in colors that had no human names. Engines hummed in frequency that some species could hear and others could only feel in their bones. It was, without argument, most important station in the known galaxy, and today it was full. The Galactic Concord held its Armistice Renewal Summit once every 30 years. Every major power sent someone. Admirals came in their dress uniforms, heavy with medals and colored ribbons that told stories of old wars. Ambassadors came in robes that cost more than some planets earned in a year. Diplomats came with briefcases full of documents and assistants who carried even more documents behind them. Everyone who was anyone in the galaxy had found a reason to be on Korvan. Today, the docking bay of Section 12 was quieter than the others. It was reserved for high-level arrivals. The floor was polished to a mirror shine. The lighting was softer here, warmer, meant to make important guests feel welcomed. 2 rows of station staff stood at the entrance in neat lines, their uniforms pressed and their eyes forward. Princess Vale, soon of the Etheric Dominion, stepped off her ship and onto the station floor. Without slowing her pace, she was tall, even for a Etheric. Her skin was a deep blue-gray, the color of deep ocean water. Just before a storm, her eyes were silver with no visible pupil, which made it difficult for other species to tell where she was looking. She wore a traveling coat of dark red with gold stitching along the edges. Black hair was pulled back tightly in the style of Etheric nobility. She did not smile. Etheric royalty rarely did in public. Smiling in their culture was something done in private among family. In public, you kept your face still and your back straight. Behind her came her personal guard, 4 soldiers in dark armor, each one nearly 2 m tall. Then came 2 advisors, both older than men who had spent their entire careers in service to the royal family. Then came 3 junior staff members carrying luggage and documents. Vale barely noticed any of them. She had walked with a guard and staff behind her since she was 4 years old. It was simply part of the air she moved through. She was looking at the station itself, reading it. Vale had a habit of studying places the way other people studied books. She looked at the architecture and noted which species had the most influence in the design. She looked at the staff and noted their species postures, which one seemed nervous and which one seemed bored. She looked at the other ships docked nearby and counted flags. Silver eyes moved through the bay steadily, quietly, missing nothing. That was how she saw it. At the far end of the docking bay, near the main corridor entrance, there were 6 figures standing in a line. Not station staff. These were military officers, real ones, trope decorated ones, the kind whose uniforms told you immediately that they had not spent their careers behind desks. She recognized the deep blue and silver of the Velar Naval Command. She recognized the black and red of the Drenic Collective's High Fleet. She recognized the ancient gray-green of the Oyan Order, whose admirals were so old that some of them has been serving before humanity had left its solar system. 6 admirals standing in a perfect line, and they were saluting not the station, not a flag, Not each other, they were saluting a person walking toward them from a smaller docking gate off to the left. Valley stopped walking, advisors nearly walked into her back. One of them whispered a quick apology. She did not hear it. She was watching the person the admirals were saluting. He was human. She could tell immediately. Humans had a particular look to them, soft-edged. Compared to most species, shorter than average, that strange warm-toned skin. That came in many shades. This one was somewhere in his middle years, perhaps 45 or 50 by human counting. He was not especially tall. He was not especially broad. He wore plain gray clothing, not a uniform, not robes, nothing that marked rank or status, no medals, no insignia, no weapons at his side. He carried a single small bag over one shoulder, the kind a traveler used for short trips. He walked the way people walk when they are comfortable, not slow, not fast, just steady. His hands were in his pockets. He glanced around the bay with mild interest. The way a person looks at a city they have visited several times before, familiar. Unbothered, the 6 admirals held their salute as he passed in front of them. He gave them a small nod, not a salute back, just a nod, the way you might nod to a neighbor you saw every morning on the way to work. The admirals lowered their hands only after he had passed completely and started walking further into the station. Vale stared. She turned to Orth, the senior member of her guard. He was the longest serving soldier in her personal detail, Aikme, of 53 years, who had seen 3 wars and 2 political revolutions, and who was in her experience impossible to surprise. He was staring at the floor. Orth, she said quietly, Your Highness, who precisely is this human? There was a pause, a small pause. She noticed it. Orth was not a man who paused. He answered questions the way a door opened. Immediately and without hesitation. His name is Elias Vaughn, Orth said. That tells me nothing, she said. Why are 6 admirals saluting a man in plain clothes? Another pause. It is a long answer, Your Highness. Then begin it. Orth finally looked up, but not at her. He was looking at the corridor where the human had disappeared. His expression was not easy to read. Orthod's face was not usually difficult to read. He had one of those honest, open soldiers' faces that showed what it was thinking, but right now what it was thinking seemed complicated. Perhaps, he said carefully, it would be better discussed in your quarters once we are settled. Vilith looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the corridor again. The human was gone. The 6 admirals had already broken their line and were moving in different directions, back to their own business, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if saluting an unremarkable man in gray clothes was a completely normal part of their day. Very well, she said, and she started walking again toward the check-in hall. But her mind was not moving forward with her feet. Her mind had stayed at that far end of the docking bay, looking at the shape of 6 decorated military officers with their hands raised to a man who carried no rank and wore no medals and seemed entirely unconcerned with any of it. It stayed there, and it turned the image over and over, looking for the explanation that felt right. It did not find one. Vale's quarters were on level 14 in the diplomatic wing, reserved for royal guests. The rooms were large and well furnished in a neutral style that tried not to favor any one species' taste. The furniture was made to be adjustable, the lighting Could be changed, the temperature. Controls were easy to reach. Someone had placed a small arrangement of synthetic flowers on the table near the window. Not real flowers, because real flowers from one species world sometimes caused allergic reactions in others, but the imitation was careful and respectful. She did not sit down. She stood at the wide window and looked out at the stars. Ships moved slowly past in the distance. A Velkarin cruiser, sleek in silver. Round Drenic transport vessel, practical and ugly. 3 smaller ships she did not recognize, flying in a loose cluster. Probably independent. Who had come to the station to take advantage of the summit's traffic. She heard Orth and closed the door behind him. Tell me, she said without turning around. Orth took a breath. Ellis Vaughn. He was a commander in the human Interstellar Navy Tactical Division. He served for approximately 20 years before he resigned his commission. Resigned. She repeated voluntarily. Yes, why that is not entirely clear, Your Highness. The records are available, but the reasons he gave were personal. She turned around then. And why do admirals of 6 separate species salute a man who no longer holds rank? Orth was quiet for a moment. He had the look of some deciding how to carry something heavy, trying to figure out which way to hold it, because of what he did 12 years ago. He said, finally, when humanity was first brought before the conquered, she waited. There was a war, I said, between the humans and the Drenic. It started badly, a misunderstanding during first contact. Ships were destroyed on both sides. Within the first week, the conquered projections said it would last at minimum 120 years. The Drenic are not a species that stops once they start. Vale knew this. The Drenic were one of the oldest and most stubborn warrior cultures in the galaxy. They had fought wars that lasted generations. Stopping was not something they did easily, and she said, and Elias Vaughn ended it. Orth said, in 11 days. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the stars continued their indifferent drifting. Small maintenance craft puttered past, its yellow light blinking slowly. Vale looked at Orth for a long moment. Then she looked back at the window. How? She asked. Orth opened his mouth, then closed it, then third time since she had asked him a simple question. In the docking bay, he paused. He walked onto Drenic command ship. Orth said, unarmed. The maintenance craft disappeared of the station. That is insane. Vale said, yes. Orth agreed. The Drenic thought so too. That is apparently part of why it worked. She said nothing. She turned back to the window, and her silver eyes moved across the stars without really seeing them. She was seeing instead the image of a man in gray clothes, walking calmly across the docking bay floor, nodding pleasantly at a row of admirals, as if they were old friends who happened to be standing outside. No medals, no rank, no hurry, just a nod, and 6 of the most powerful military officers in the galaxies holding their salute until he had passed. Tomorrow the summit would begin. There would be speeches and arguments and documents to review. She would represent her father's empire, and she would do it well because she always did. But tonight, Vale stood at her window in the diplomatic wing of the most important station in the galaxy, and she thought about a human named Elias Vaughn, and she thought with a feeling she did not entirely like that. She needed to know more. At the far end of her thoughts, quietly and without much ceremony, a question began to settle in, not who he was exactly, but what kind of person ends a H-100 Red Year War. In 11 days, resigns his rank and then shows up at the galaxy's most important summit in plain gray clothes with a travel bag over one shoulder. What kind of person did that, and why of all the people he could have come here to speak to had she already been told by her third advisor, who had received the message only minutes after arrival, that Elias Vaughn had formally requested private meeting with her, specifically. She pressed one hand against the cold glass of the window and looked out at the dark between the stars. Interesting, she said quietly to no one. Vale did not sleep well that night. This was unusual. She had been trained since childhood to sleep when sleep was available and to rest her mind between difficult tasks. A princess who could not sleep was a princess who would make tired decisions, and tired decisions, father had told her many times, were how empires cracked. But she lay in the dark of her quarters on level 14 and stared at the ceiling and thought about a human in gray clothes. She got up before the station's artificial morning cycle began. She dressed without calling her attendants. She sat at the desk near the window with a cup of warm keth, the dark etheric drink that tasted something like burned bark and honey. And she opened personal records terminal. She typed a name, Elias Vaughn. The file that came back was not large. That was the first thing she noticed. For a man who had apparently ended a war in 11 days and earned the permanent respect of 6 admirals from different species, the official record was surprisingly thin. Name, age, species human, former rank commander, human, interstellar navy, tactical division, date of commission, date of resignation, a list of missions that were mostly marked with a small gray lock symbol, meaning the details were classified above her current access level, and at the bottom, one entry that was not locked. Come and ceasefire negotiation, year 23 of 12, duration 11 standard days, outcome full cessation of hostilities, treaty signed aboard Dren command vessel, Vorkadeth lead negotiator, Commander Elias Vaughn, acting independently and without official Concord sanction. She read that last part twice. Without official Concord sanction, he had done it on his own, without permission, without backup, without the Concord's blessing or the support of any other species. A junior tactical officer had simply decided on his own to walk onto an enemy warship and talk until the war stopped. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling again. She had met a great many people in her life who were considered impressive. She had met fleet admirals who had won battles against impossible odds. She had met scientists who had solved problems that other scientists had spent lifetimes trying to crack. She had met diplomats so skilled with words that they could make an enemy feel grateful for losing. She had never met someone who had ended a war alone, without orders, and then apparently decided that the right next step was to resign and go home. She closed the terminal and finished her keth. Then she got dressed properly, called for Orth, told him she wanted to visit the station's Hall of Records before the summit's opening ceremony. The Hall of Records on Corvathan was not a place most summit guests visited. It was a wide, quiet room on level 8, lined with terminals and shelves of data storage units. The lighting was steady and white. It smelled faintly of the cleaning solution the station staff used. On the floors, a single ASEAN archivist sat behind a low desk near the entrance, reading something on a small screen and paying very little attention to the Dorb came in with only Orth behind her. Having left her other guards at the quarters, she did not want to draw attention. The Asian archivist looked up. The Own were one of the oldest species in the Concord. Their average lifespan was nearly 400 years, and the archivist looked as if he had been using every one of them. His clear throat, skin was pale brown and deeply lined. His eyes were large and dark, the patient quality of someone who had watched many things happen over a very long time. Princess Vale, he said. Without surprise, the Thyra delegation's access credentials cleared this morning. You are welcome to any non-classified records. She nodded. I am looking for historical records relating to the Drenic-human conflict year 2312. The archivist blinked slowly. L7, he said. Terminals 4 through 9, the summit's guest access package includes most of the public documentation from that period. Few items remain sealed by Concord security order. Thank you. She went to aisle 7 and sat at terminal 5. Stood a few steps behind her, arms folded, watching the entrance. She spent the next 2 hours reading. The drainage human conflict had begun as many terrible things began with a mistake. Human exploration vessel, the Ardent March, a mid-sized science ship on a deep mapping mission, had crossed into a region of space the Dren considered sacred, not politically sensitive, not militarily strategic. Sacred, a place where the Drenic believed their first ancestors had come from long ago. Before recorded history, the human crew had not known this. The region was not marked on any Concord map because the Drenic had never shared that information with anyone. They had no reason to. Other species stayed away naturally because the region had little of obvious value. The Ardent March had been scanning an interesting asteroid formation. That was all. Scanning rocks. The Drenic had destroyed it in approximately 4 minutes. Then they had destroyed the 2 ships sent to find out what happened to the Ardent March. Then humanity, understandably, had sent warships. The Concord's records described the next 3 months as a period of rapidly escalating hostility with low probability of diplomatic resolution. In plain language, both sides were angry. Both sides were shooting, and nobody who was watching believed it was going to stop anytime soon. The Dreno did not negotiate from fear. They negotiated from respect, and respect in their culture was earned through combat. Species that wanted peace had to first prove it deserved to be spoken to. Humanity had proved it. Fight. The records noted that humans' tactical adaptations during the first 3 months had surprised the Dren considerably. Humans were not the strongest species. They were not the fastest, but they were creative in ways that were difficult to predict, and they were stubborn in ways that were genuinely alarming. The Drenish commanders had revised their 100 red year projection down to 60 years, which they noted with what the records described as something approaching professional admiration. And then on the 93rd day of the conflict, a single human shuttle had approached the Drench command vessel Vorkadith without weapons, without a military escort, broadcasting on the Dren command frequency a message in broken but recognizable Drenok that translated roughly as: I would like to talk. I am coming in. Please do not shoot me. The shuttle had continued toward the Vorkadith. The Drenic had not shot it. The records noted that the Drenish commander, a senior war leader named HFY, had later said in a post-treaty interview that the reason he had not destroyed the shuttle immediately was simple: he had never 40 years of military service seen anything so straightforwardly strange. An unarmed human alone flying toward a Drenic command vessel in the middle of an active war, broadcasting a request to talk. HFY had said in that interview that his first thought was that the human was either the bravest person he had ever encountered or the most foolish. His second thought was that he wanted to find out which one, so he had let the shuttle dock. Elias Vaughn had walked off the shuttle, carrying nothing but a translation device and a small container of human coffee which he had offered to share. HFY had declined the coffee, but had listened what exactly was said. During those 11 days aboard the Vorkth was still partially sealed. Public record contained only the broad shape of it. Vaughn had not argued that the Dren were wrong. He had not demanded an apology. He had acknowledged that the human crew of the Ardent March had violated sacred space through ignorance, that ignorance was not innocence, and that humanity accepted the weight of that mistake. He had then asked plainly and without political language the Dren needed in order for this to be over. The Drenic had not been asked that question before, not by anyone. Every other species that had ever come into conflict with them had argued, threatened, offered money, offered territory, or run away. Nobody had ever simply asked what they needed. They had told him. He had agreed to what he could agree to and had been honest about what required it. Government's approval. He had sent 3 messages back to the human interstellar command during those 11 days, each one apparently causing considerable alarm among the admirals who received them. On the 11th day, the treaty had been signed. Vale leaned back from the terminal. Her keth was long finished. The hall of records was still quiet. Around her, the only sound the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant clicking of the old archivist. Turning pages, she thought about the Dren. She had met Dren officers before. She knew what they were like: hard, proud, ancient in their culture, deeply serious about honor. The idea of them sitting across a table from a young human and deciding after 11 days that he had earned enough respect to end a war. It was not nothing. It was in fact one of the more remarkable things she had read in recent memory. She stood up and smoothed her coat. Find out if Counselor VTH Oren is available, she said to Orth. I want to speak with him before the opening ceremony. Orth nodded. VTH Oren was a Velcron diplomat she had known for several years, careful, honest, and old enough to have been at the Concord during the Drenic conflict. If anyone would speak plainly to her about Elias Vaughn, it was VTH. They left the hall of records and walked back toward the diplomatic wing. The station corridors were busier now, filling with delegates and staff moving toward the ceremony hall. Different species brushed past each other with the practiced politeness of people been doing this for a long time. Vale walked through all of it without really seeing it. She was thinking about a man who had flown an unarmed shuttle into the middle of a war and asked the enemy what they needed. And she was thinking about the message waiting on her terminal back in her quarters, the formal, politely worded request for a private meeting signed at the bottom in plain text, Elias Vaughn. No title, no rank, just a name. She had planned to ignore the request until After the opening ceremony, she had planned to review it carefully with her advisors and decide whether it was worth her time. She was no longer planning that. She turned to Orth as they walked, sent a reply to Vaughn's request. She said, "Tell him I will meet him this evening, the observation deck, on level 17, 1 hour after the ceremony ends." Orth looked at her alone. "Highness, you will be outside the door." She said, "That is close enough." He said nothing more. He sent the message. And somewhere on the other side of the station, in a small and ordinary guest room that had been assigned to him without ceremony, Elias Vaughn received it. He read it once. He sat down his cup of coffee and looked out his own window at the same stars. Then he nodded to himself, the same small, quiet nod he had given the Admirals in the docking, and went back to reading the notes he had been preparing for 3 weeks. He had a great deal of work still to do, but the most important meeting of the summit, he suspected, just been the opening ceremony of the Armistice Renewal Summit, was exactly what Valith had expected. Long speeches, formal greetings in 7 languages, a large holographic display of the Conqueror's founding charter rotating slowly above the chamber floor, while an orchestra, mixed species, played something that was meant to sound hopeful and mostly succeeded. Chamber was full of bright uniforms and expensive robes, and the particular kind of careful, polished smiling that politicians did when they were being watched. Sat in the Thyrek delegation's assigned seats and listened and smiled at correct moments and shook hands with 3 ambassadors she had met before and 1 she had not. She said the right things. She was good at this. She had been doing it since she was 12 years old, and her father had begun bringing her to state events so she could learn the shape of them. She noticed once from across the chamber a figure in gray sitting in the back row of the general observers section, not the diplomatic seats, not the military seats, the observers section, where junior staff accredited guests sat when they had no official role in the proceedings. Elias Vaughn was sitting there with his hands folded in his lap, watching the ceremony with the same calm, mild interest he had shown in the docking bay. Ale Sharon, Admiral 2, rose in front of him, turned around once, spotted him, gave him a small, respectful nod. He nodded back. Neither of them spoke. Valith looked away. Level 17 was one of the quieter parts of the station. The observation deck, there was not the large public one on level 22 that most guests used. This one was smaller, accessed through a side corridor that most visitors never found. It had a curved, transparent wall that looked out at the stars, a few low seats arranged near the glass, and nothing else. No bar, no staff, no decorations, just the dark and the stars and the soft hum of the station around it. Vale arrived 4 minutes early. She had sent her other guards to wait at the corridor entrance below. Orth stood just outside the observation deck door, close enough to hear if she called. She stood at the glass and looked out. A large Drin warship was docked on the far side of the station, its lights visible in the distance, red and amber, slow and steady. She looked at it and thought about the Vorkadith, about a man in a small shuttle broadcasting a request in broken Drennic, "Please do not shoot me." She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She listened. One set of footsteps. Unhurried, no armor, no weapons. She could tell by the sound, just shoes on a smooth floor. The footsteps stopped. A Few meters away, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be rude. Princess Vale, said a voice. It was a calm voice, somewhat low, the kind of voice that did not feel the need to perform itself. She turned. He was the same as he had looked in the docking bay, plain gray clothes, no insignia. He was carrying 2 small cups, one in each hand, and the smell that came with him was warm and dark and unfamiliar to her. I brought coffee, he said, human drink. You do not have to take it. I just find it difficult to have a conversation without something in my hands. She looked at the cups. What does it taste like? Burned and bitter and a little sweet, he said. Most species hate it. Some love it. I have never been able to predict which way it goes. She considered for a moment, then she crossed the short distance between them, and Clear's throat took the cup. He sat down in one of the low seats near the glass, not waiting for her permission, but not in a way that felt rude, in a way that felt simply natural, as if he sat wherever it seemed reasonable to sit. She remained standing for a moment, then decided that standing while he sat made her look like she was waiting for something which she was not. She sat in the seat across from him. She tried the coffee. It tasted exactly as he had described. She was not certain she liked it. She was not certain she did not. You asked to meet me specifically, she said. I did, before we had ever spoken. Yes. Why? He looked out at the stars for a moment, not avoiding the question, thinking about how to answer it. Honestly, she had interviewed enough people to know the difference. Because fake Dominion is the only major power that has not agreed to the new armistice terms, he said, and your father will not decide without your recommendation, and you are the most careful thinker in your delegation. He paused. Possibly in this station. She did not show anything on her face. You have been studying my delegation. I have been studying everyone. He said, it is what I do before these things. I try to understand who the people are before I try to understand what the problem is. And what is the problem in your view? He turned to look at her directly. His eyes were brown. She noticed a warm, ordinary brown. Problem is that your father's empire has 3 territorial concerns that the current draft of the armistice does not address. 2 of them are genuine. One of them is a negotiating position that you yourselves do not expect to win. I believe the 2 genuine ones can be resolved with language adjustments in Articles 9 and 14. The third one, the negotiating position, can be dropped without losing anything real. Vale was quiet for a moment. She had read the armistice draft. Her advisors had read it. They had spent 4 days before leaving the preparing their list of concerns, and this man sitting here in plain gray clothes with a cup of coffee had just identified their position more precisely than the summary document her father's chief minister had written. You are very confident, she said. Not especially, he said. I might be wrong about which concern is the negotiating position, but I do not think I am. And if I told you that all 3 concerns were genuine, he looked at her with those ordinary brown eyes and said, simply and without cruelty, I would not believe you. She felt a small, unexpected pull at the corner of her mouth. Not quite close to one. You are direct, she said. It saves time, he said, and I find that most people, when spoken to directly, are more honest in return. It is a fair trade. She looked down at the coffee in her hands. The warmth of it was pleasant, even if the taste was still making up its mind. My advisors told me not to meet you, she said. That does not surprise me. They said you were known to be persuasive in ways that were difficult to identify until after the fact. He smiled at that. It was a real smile, not a political one. It reached his eyes and sat there comfortably. That is a very polite way of calling someone manipulative. Are you? He thought about it, seriously thought about it, which she had not expected. I think the difference between manipulation and persuasion is whether you are honest, he said. I try very hard to be honest. I do not always succeed, but I try. He paused. You are welcome to tell me when you think I am not being honest. I would rather know. She studied him. This was the part of a conversation she was best at, the still quiet reading of another person. She had done it her whole life. She did it now slowly and thoroughly. He let her. He did not shift in his seat or try to fill the silence or perform patience the way some people did. He simply sat with his coffee and waited, looking out at the stars with an expression that was genuinely calm. That, she thought, was the strangest thing about him. The calm was real. It was not a mask. She had seen enough masks to know. Tell me something true, she said. Finally, about yourself, not about the armistice, not about my father's empire. Something true about you. He was quiet for a moment. I am tired, he said. She waited. Not physically, he said. I mean the kind of tired that comes from spending 20 years watching things almost go wrong, almost watching species that are intelligent and old and capable of extraordinary things get right to the edge of destroying each other over borders and pride and old insults that nobody even fully remembers anymore. He turned the cup in his hand slowly. I ended that war with the Dren 12 years ago, and I thought maybe things would change, and some things did. Then there is always another, almost always another edge. He paused. I am tired of the edge. The observation deck was very quiet. Outside the glass, the stars were still and cold and very far away. Then why are you here? She asked. You resigned. You could have stayed home. I could, he said, but I know something that most people here do not. He looked at her. I know what it looks like when things actually go wrong, not almost actually, because humanity spent 1,000 years doing it to itself. We have the history. We have the records. We have the ruins. He said the last words simply without drama, and somehow that made it heavier. I would rather be tired on a space station trying to prevent the next catastrophe than comfortable at home, knowing I could have helped and did not. Vale looked at him for a long time. She thought about her father, about the Theoric Empire, which was old and proud, and had its own ruins, its own long history of wars that had started over things that seemed important at the time. She thought about the 3 territorial concerns in the armistice draft, and which one of them was really a negotiating clear's throat position, and she knew if she was honest with herself that she had known since the second day of reading the draft. You said Articles 9 and 14, she said. Yes, specific language changes. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small folded piece of actual paper, not a data screen paper. He unfolded it and handed it to her. She looked at it. The changes were handwritten in clear and readable script. They were also, she had to admit, as she read them, precisely correct, not compromises that weakened the Thyrak position, actual solutions that addressed what her father genuinely needed. You wrote this on paper, she Said screenons can be intercepted, he said paper is harder to read from. Across a room, she looked up at him, he. Clear's throat was not smiling, there was something in his expression that was close to it, something quiet and a little warm. Who taught you to think like this? She asked. Mostly mistakes. He said, mine and other people's. It is the most expensive education available, but it is also the most thorough. She folded the paper carefully and held it in her hand. Outside the glass, the Drenic warship's lights blinked slowly. The dark red and amber, patient and steady. I will read these carefully. Tonight I will speak to my advisors. Of course, he said, I am not promising anything. I know, he said. She stood. He stood with her, not because protocol demanded it, because it was the natural thing to do when a person stood. She noticed that too, the way he moved through social moments without thinking about them, the way someone moves through a room they have lived in for years. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back. Coffee, she said. It is not as bad as I expected. He smiled again, that real comfortable smile. It grows on you. He said, things worth having do. She left. Outside in the corridor, Orth fell into step beside her without a word. He glanced at her face, and whatever he saw there made him say nothing at all, which was the right decision. She walked back toward her quarters with a folded piece of paper in her hand and the warm, bitter aftertaste of human coffee on her tongue. And for the first time since arriving on Corvan, she felt like she understood at least part of the answer to the question she had been carrying since the docking bay. Not all of it, not yet, but part of it. The kind of person who ended a war in 11 days was not the kind of person who was impressive in obvious ways. He was not loud, he was not grand, he did not fill a room with his presence the way warriors and kings did. He was the kind of person who showed up with 2 cups of coffee and a piece of paper and said things that were so honest they were almost uncomfortable, and somehow that was worse, more difficult to prepare for, more difficult to dismiss. She would sleep tonight, she thought. She would think first. There was still much more to understand. The second day of the summit began quietly, too quietly, Vale thought as she took her seat in the grand chamber of the Galactic Concord. She had attended enough political gatherings to know that quiet at the start facely meant noise later, the kind of noise that was difficult to stop once it started. The grand chamber was the largest room on Corvan. It was built to impress, and it succeeded. The ceiling was high and curved, made of a pale material that caught the light and spread it evenly across the room so that no corner was darker than any other. The delegation sat in a wide semicircle around a central floor where speakers stood when addressing the full assembly. Each delegation had a long table with their species flag mounted behind it, their names printed in the 6 official Concord languages on small plates at the front. Vale sat at the Thyrec table with her 2 senior advisors on either side and her guard positioned along the wall behind. She had the folded piece of paper in the inner pocket of her coat. She had read it 4 times the night before. She had read Articles 9 and 14 of the Armistice draft 6 times. She had spoken to her first advisor, an old and cautious man named Seville, who had read Elias Vaughn's suggested language changes twice, said nothing for a long moment, and then said quietly that they were correct. She had not told Seville where the changes came from. She had said she had been thinking through the draft on her own. Seville had looked at her in a way that suggested he did not entirely believe this, but he was too professional to say so. She looked across the chamber now, scanning the room the way she always did. The Velera delegation to her left, the Drenok delegation straight ahead, their table larger than most, their officers sitting with the particular stillness of a species that had learned long ago that physical control was a form of strength. The Aeon delegation to the far right, their elder representatives sitting so motionless they might have been carved from stone if not for the occasional slow blink, and in the back row of the observer section, in the same seat he had occupied the day before, Elias Vaughn, same gray clothes, same folded hands, same mild, attentive expression. She looked away. The morning session went smoothly enough. The Concord's chief mediator, Talvel Sean named Councillor Esavorath, led the assembly through the first 7 articles of the armistice draft with practiced efficiency. There were questions, there were small objections, there were the expected speeches from delegations who needed to be seen speaking before their home audiences. All of it moved forward at the slow, grinding pace of large political processes. Then the afternoon session began. The trouble started the middle of a discussion about Article 11, which concerned navigation shits in the Corvin Belt, a wide band of asteroid systems that sat at the intersection of 3 different species' territorial boundaries. The belt had been a source of minor conflict for decades. Ships from the Velshara, the Drenok, and a smaller species called the Fereth all had incidents there. The armistice draft proposed a shared navigation zone with rotating patrol rights. The Firth delegation's lead speaker, a young officer named Tesser Vane, who was clearly nervous and clearly trying not to show it, stood to raise a concern about the patrol rotation schedule. She had barely finished her second sentence when the lead Drenok representative, War Councillor Bakathun, no relation to Valeth's family despite the shared name, interrupted her. He did not shout. Drenok did not shout in formal settings, but his voice carried the flat, heavy weight of a species that had been arguing by volume of authority rather than volume of sound for 10,000 years. The Farth concern regarding patrol schedules is a distraction from the central issue. Bates soon said the central issue is that the Faisal sure have been conducting unauthorized survey operations in the eastern Corvin Belt for the past 14 months. This is a violation of the existing agreement, and the Concord's response has been inadequate. The Velera lead representative was on his feet before Bankathun had finished speaking. The survey operations were conducted within Velshara territorial waters as defined by the 2287 boundary agreement, he said, his voice sharp and precise. The Drenok objection is based on a selective reading of that agreement which has been rejected by the Concord's legal com on 3 separate occasions. The legal committee's rulings do not supersede territorial sovereignty, Bates soon replied. The legal committee's rulings are the mechanism by which territorial sovereignty is determined within the Concord framework. That framework was written by species who were not present at the 2287 negotiation. See, that framework is the reason we are all in this room rather than shooting at each other. Councillor Esavorath was standing at the speaker's position. calling for order. Her voice was calm and firm and completely ignored. Around the chamber, other delegations were leaning toward each other, speaking in low, urgent voices. The ashen elder representatives had stopped blinking, which Vale had learned was their version of sharp attention. The fourth speaker, Tesser Bain, was still standing at her position with her notes in her hands, lit around the chamber with the expression of someone who had lit what they thought Wada was a small candle and discovered it was connected to something considerably larger. 3 more delegations began speaking at once. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Concord Teen, which had been built for the careful and orderly management of interspecies politics, began to sound like an argument at a very large and very consequential family dinner. Vale sat back in her chair and watched. She had seen this before, not this exact argument, but this shape of argument, the kind that started on a specific point and quickly became about everything that had been sitting underneath the specific point for years. The Velera and the Drenok had a long and complicated history in the Corvin Belt that predated the current armistice by at least 40 years. The survey operations were real, the objection was real, but neither of those things was really what was happening in the chamber right now. What was happening was that 2 old, proud, powerful species had found a moment where the structure of the summit had loosened just enough to let the older, harder feelings out, and once those were out, they were difficult to put back. She watched Counselor Voreth try 3 more times to call the room to order. Each time the voices fell slightly and then rose again, like water pushed down in one place that simply came up in another. Vale's first advisor, Seville, leaned toward her. If this continues, he said quietly, the afternoon session will collapse. If the afternoon session collapses, the Vela and Dren delegations may formally suspend participation. That would effectively end the summit. I know, she said. The entire armistice renewal. I know, she said again, more quietly. She was looking at the back of the room. Elias Vaughn was sitting in exactly the same position he had been in all morning, folded hands, calm expression. He was watching the chamber floor with the focused, quiet attention of someone who was reading a complicated text. He was not moving. Vale waited. Voreth called for order again. The voices dropped slightly, rose again. Drenish War Counselor and the Vela representative were now directly addressing each other rather than the chamber, which was technically a procedural violation, but which nobody was currently in a position to enforce. 2 more minutes passed, then Elias Vaughn stood up. He did not call out. He did not raise his hand. He simply stood up from his seat in the back row of the observers section. The room did not go immediately silent. It went in stages. The Velsharan Admiral in the military section, who had nodded to him the day before, saw him standing and stopped speaking. His neighbor noticed and stopped. A ripple moved through the room, quiet following quiet, delegation by delegation, until the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Concord was completely still. It took perhaps 15 seconds. Counselor Voreth looked at the back of the room. Her expression was difficult to read, something between relief and professional discomfort, because what was happening was not part of the established procedure. Elias Vaughn was not a delegate. He had no official seat. He had no title, rank, no position within the Concord structure that gave him the right to the chamber floor. He spoke anyway. I apologize for the interruption, he said. His voice was the same as it had been on the observation deck, calm, not loud, clear enough to reach every corner of the room without effort. I am not a delegate. I do not have speaking rights, Counselor Voreth. If you would prefer I sit down, I will sit down. Counselor Voreth looked at him for a moment, then she made a small gesture with one hand that was not quite permission and not quite refusal. It was the gesture of someone stepping back to see what would happen. The disagreement about the Corvin Belt survey operations, Elias said, is based on a mapping error. The chamber stayed silent. The 2287 boundary agreement used navigational reference points that were accurate at the time, he continued. In the 38 years since, 3 of those reference points have shifted due to gravitational drift from the Corvin Belt's inner asteroid movement. The result is that the boundary line as drawn in 2287 no longer matches the boundary line as it exists physically in space. The Velshara survey operations were conducted inside what the 2287 map shows as Velshara territory. The Drenic objection is based on where that boundary actually sits. Today, he paused. Both delegations are correct, he said, based on the information they each have. The disagreement is not about sovereignty or rights or violations. It is about a map that is 38 years out of date. Silence in the chamber had a different quality now. It was not the silence of a room waiting for the next argument. It was the silence of a room that had just been handed an exit from a room it had not known how to leave. The Concord's cartographic office completed an updated boundary survey of the Bahan Belt 11 months ago. Elias said port was filed and has not yet been formally introduced into the current treaty process. If the updated map is adopted as the reference document for Article 11 in question, fall within Vishara Charara territory as currently defined, and the Drenic objection is resolved without either delegation conceding a point of principle. He reached into his pocket, took out a small data chip, and held it up. I have the updated survey on this chip. I have had it for 3 weeks. Was waiting to see if it would come up through the proper channels before raising it. He paused again. Nobody spoke. Then Counselor Voreth stepped forward and held out her hand for the chip. Her expression was entirely professional, which meant it revealed nothing. Her eyes were doing something complicated. A station aide carried the chip from Vaughn to Voreth. She inserted it into the chamber's display system. The updated Corvin Belt boundary map appeared on the main screen above the chamber floor, large, clear, undeniable. The Drenic War Counselor Baketh soon looked at the map for a long moment, then he sat down. The Velian representative looked at the map, then he sat down. Tess Orin, the first speaker who had started all of this, slowly lowered her notes to the table and let out a breath that was visible from across the room. Counselor Voreth called for a 15-minute recess. Her voice was perfectly steady. The room began to move and breathe again. Voices returned, quieter now, different in texture. The low working voices of people returning to the actual task rather than the louder voices of people defending positions. Balith sat at the etheric table and did not move for a moment. She was looking at the back of the room, where Elias Vaughn had already sat back down. He was speaking quietly to the Velsharin Admiral beside him, something brief that made the Admiral nod. Then he folded his hands in his lap again, and looked at the chamber floor with that same mild tentative expression. 4 minutes. He had spoken for 4 minutes. She turned to her advisor, Seville. His face was doing something she had not seen it do very often in their years together. Something that was close to amazement. Carefully controlled, sitting just below the surface. He had that map for 3 weeks, she said quietly. Yes, Seville said. He prepared for this, it appears. So she looked back at the observers section. He knew this argument was going to happen. Seville was quiet for a moment. He knew it was possible, he said. Carefully, he prepared for the possibility. That is, he stopped. Started again. That is considerable preparation, Your Highness, she said. Nothing. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and touched the folded piece of paper with her fingertips, the one he had handed her the night before, handwritten already, prepared before they had even met. He had understood the situation well enough to know what she needed before she had told him. 3 weeks. He had been preparing for 3 weeks, not the summit, not the speeches, not the opening ceremony, the actual problems, the ones underneath, the ones that were going to surface eventually and needed to be met with something real when they did. Around her, the grand chamber of the galactic Concord was slowly returning to order. Delegates settling back into their seats, aides moving with quiet purpose, the machinery of diplomacy finding its rhythm again. Valley sat very still and thought about a man who showed up without rank or title and sat in the back of the room and waited patiently and without drama for the moment when what he had prepared would be needed. She turned to Seville. After the session, she said, I want to send a preliminary communication to my father. Seville looked at her. About the armistice terms, about Articles 9 and 14, she said, and about recommendation. Seville held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded, slow and careful, and opened his notes. At the front of the chamber, Councillor Voreth called the session back to order, and in the back row of the observers section, Elias Vaughn unfolded his hands, reached into his jacket, and took out a small notebook. He opened it to a page that was already half covered in handwriting. He turned to the next page and began writing again. The final session of the Armistice Renewal Summit ended on the 3rd day, just after midday. It ended. Well, that was not a small thing in the entire recorded history of the galactic Concord. No Armistice Renewal Summit had ever ended with full unanimous agreement from every major power. There had always been holdouts, always one delegation that signed with reservations, or one that delayed, or one that went home early and sent a written agreement 3 weeks later with a list of conditions attached. The Concord had learned to accept this shell agreement was still agreement. A signed document with footnotes was still better than no document at all. This time every delegation signed. Theoric Dominion signed last because Vale had asked Councillor Voreth for that position. Deliberately, not out of drama, out of respect for what the moment was. If the Thyra were the final piece that completed the first unanimous armistice in Concord history, she wanted that to be clear and visible and recorded properly. She signed her name in the Thyrak formal script and then in the Concord standard script below it, and she placed the seal of her father's house at the bottom of the document. The chamber was quiet while she did it. Then there was a sound that began at the Sharon table and moved outward, not quite Applause because several species present. Did not use applause but something that served the same purpose, a collective release, a shared exhale that had been held for 3 days. Vale set down the pen and looked at the document for a moment, then she looked at the back of the room. The observer section was emptying as people stood and began moving toward each other, shaking hands, and exchanging the formal words that came after agreements were made. Elias Vaughn was still in his seat. He was looking at the signed document on the chamber floor with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was quieter than his usual expression, if that was possible, softer around the edges, the expression of someone who had wanted something for a long time and was not quite sure yet what to do with the fact that they had it. She watched him for a moment, then she turned to her work because there was still work to do. Statements to prepare, communications to send to her father, the formal closing reception to attend. She was a princess of the thy dominion, and she had a role to play in each of those things, but she noted quietly where Elias Vaughn was sitting, and she decided that she would find him at the reception. The closing reception was held in the station's largest common hall on level 10. The ceiling was high and the lighting was warm, and someone had made a serious effort with the decorations, long banners in the colors of every member species hanging in careful order. From the ceiling beams, tables ran along the walls covered in food and drink from a dozen different worlds, each one labeled in 6 languages so nobody accidentally ate something their biology was not prepared for. The room was full and loud and warm, in the way that rooms are warm when the thing people were afraid might go wrong has gone right. Vale moved through it with purpose. She spoke to the Velarin counselor for 6 minutes about the language adjustments in Article 9, which had been accepted without significant debate once introduced, because Elias suggested changes had been correct as she had known they would be. She spoke to the far speaker, Tess Orin, who looked considerably less terrified than she had in the chamber, and who said something gracious about the Thyrak delegation's patience during the difficult second day. She accepted a glass of something pale and cool from a passing tray and held it without drinking it, and moved through the room at the steady, unhurried pace of someone who knew how to be present at events like this. She found Elias near the far end of the hall, standing beside a wide viewport that looked out at open space. He was talking to a young Velarin officer, very young, barely past training age, with the look of someone at first major summit who was trying to appear as if they attended these things regularly. Elias was listening to something the young officer was saying with complete attention, the way he listened to everything, as if what was being said was the most interesting thing currently happening. She waited until the conversation reached a natural pause. The young officer saw her coming, registered who she was, and excused himself with speed. That was almost funny. Elias turned. He saw her, in the quiet, real smile appeared. Princess Vale, he said, you were very kind to that young officer. She said he was nervous. Aaliyah said simply, nervous people do better when someone listens to them. It costs nothing. She stood beside him at the viewport. Outside, the stars were the same as they always were, constant and cold and very far away, indifferent to whether the species beneath them managed to keep from destroying each other. She had always found that steadying for some reason the stars did not care. Responsibility was entirely theirs. My father will receive the signed armistice document tonight, she said. I know, he said. Congratulations, it was the right decision. You were certain I would make it. He considered this. I was hopeful. He said, there is a difference. She looked at him sideways. You were certain, she said. I could tell. The night on the observation deck, you already knew. He did not deny it. I thought you would see it clearly once you had all the information, he said. You are a clear thinker. That is not certainty, that is confidence in someone's ability. He paused. It is different. She was quiet for a moment. Around them the reception moved and murmured, species mingling in the careful, cautious way they always did at these things, friendly but watchful, open but measured. It was the nature of diplomacy. You were never entirely at ease. There was always something being a zest. Except Elias, she thought. He seemed entirely at ease, not because he was not paying attention. She had learned by now that he was always paying attention, but because ease simply his natural state. The room did not create tension in him the way it created tension in everyone else. I have one more question, she said. The last one. The one I have been saving. Ask it, he said. She turned to face him properly. The Admirals, she said, in the docking bay, 6 of them from different species, different fleets, different histories. They saluted you, not a rank, not a flag. You, she paused. I understand now who you are and what you have done. I have read the records and I have watched you work, and I have spoken with you 2 hours on an observation deck. But I still do not fully understand that salute. What does it mean? What are they saluting when they salute you? He looked out at the stars for a long moment. She waited. She had learned by now that his pauses were not hesitation. They were thought, real thought, the kind that moved carefully through something before it spoke. Every one of those admirals, he said at last, has been in a moment where they believed war was the only remaining option, not because they wanted war, because every door they could see had closed, because the situation had moved past the point where they could find another way. He turned the glass in his hand slowly, and somehow in those moments a solution appeared. Not always through me. Sometimes through someone else. Sometimes through luck. Sometimes through one person asking the right question at the right time. He paused. But the point is, it appeared when they were certain there was no door left. A door appeared. He looked at her. They do not salute me, he said. They salute the reminder that even when every door looks closed, there is usually one more that has not been tried yet, that the situation is almost never as final as it feels in the worst moment. He paused. They are soldiers. They know what it costs when that door does not appear. They know what it costs in lives and years and in things that cannot be counted. So when they see someone who has made a habit of finding that door, he stopped, started again more quietly. It is not about me. It is about the idea, the stubborn, inconvenient, deeply human idea that there is always another way, even when there is no evidence for it, even when every reasonable person in the room has stopped believing it. He looked back at the stars. We nearly destroyed ourselves, he said. Humans. Multiple times we got so close, so many times, and every time someone found the door, not always in time, not always without terrible cost, often enough that we are still here. He said it plainly. without pride and without sorrow. Simple fact, I think that is what they are saluting, the fact that it is still possible, that the door is still worth looking for. The reception moved and hummed around them. Vale stood at the viewport and looked at the stars and thought about what he had said. She thought about it the way she thought about things that were important from different angles, turning it slowly, looking for the part that did not hold together. She could not find it. She thought about the empire, about her father who was old and proud and had led his people through 2 difficult decades with a kind of patience that she had not always understood when she was young, and had come to understand better as she grew older, about the wars the Thyra had fought before her lifetime, about the ones they had almost fought, about the moments that had not been recorded in any official history because they had not resulted in anything, the moments where someone had found the door and nobody had written it down because nothing had happened and nothing happening was invisible. She thought about the door. She turned to Elias. She stood straight, shoulders back, chin leveled, the formal posture, the royal posture she had been taught to hold since childhood as the correct and appropriate bearing for a princess of the Thyrak dominion in any public setting. And then slowly she bent forward at the waist, not a small nod, a real bow, deep and deliberate, held for 3 full seconds, the kind of bow that in Thyrak culture was given only to those who had earned the rarest form of respect, not the respect of rank or power or age, but the respect of genuine worthiness. It had not been done for a non-Thyrak individual in recorded Thyrak history. She straightened. Elias looked at her. Something moved in his expression, something that was not the usual calm, something that was briefly and honestly surprised, and then something that was grateful in a quiet and real way that had nothing to do with politics. He nodded the same small, unhurried nod he had given the admirals in the docking bay. "Thank you," he said. Simply, without ceremony, she inclined her head once, then she turned and walked back into the reception, back to her advisors and her duties and the long work of sending documents to her father and pairing the delegations. Departure. She did not look back. Elias finished his coffee, standing at the viewport for a few minutes more. He watched the stars, he watched the ships moving slowly in the distance, the Drenuk warship pulling away from the station heading home, a Velaran cruiser departing in the other direction, the smaller ships scattering outward like seeds. He thought about the signed armistice document sitting in the Concord's archive, the first unanimous one. He had not expected to see that in his lifetime. He had hoped, but hope and expectation were different things, as he had told Vale, and he tried always to be precise. He finished the coffee. He picked up his small travel bag from where he had left it under his chair at the Observer and LT Unk and GT's table. He said goodbye to Counselor Voreth, who shook his hand with both of hers and said nothing, which was more than enough. He nodded to the Admiral, who nodded back. He walked to the docking bay. His transport was a small, ordinary ship. No markings, no flags, the kind of ship that crossed the galaxy without anyone looking twice at it. He preferred it that way. He loaded his bag. He sat in the pilot's seat and filed his departure with the station's traffic control and waited for the clearance signal. While he waited, he opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing notes for the next situation. He had been quietly Tracking for the past 2 months. Border tension between two smaller species in the outer rim that had not yet reached the Concorde's attention, but what he estimated within the next 4 months, if nothing shifted. He had some ideas about what might shift it. The clearance signal came. He powered up the engines. The ship moved away from the station slowly, then faster, and then Corvathan was behind him, great metal arms shrinking in the rear display until it was just another light among the stars. He wrote for a while. The stars moved past the cockpit window in the long, steady silence of deep space. Somewhere in the galaxy, another problem was quietly building. It did not yet know that Elias Vaughn had already read about it, thought about it, made notes about it, and was currently on his way. He turned to a new page and kept writing.